Welcome to Resilient Earth Radio, where we host speakers from the United States and around the world to talk about critical issues facing our planet and the positive actions people are taking. We also let our listeners learn how they can get involved and make a difference. This is Leanne Lindsay, host, filmmaker, and GM of KGUA 88.3 FM independent public radio station, along with Scott and Tree Mercer of Mendonoma Whale and Seal Study in both Mendocino and Sonoma counties of Northern California. Welcome to Resilient Earth Radio. I'm Leanne Lindsay, host and producer, and this is episode 4 with Michael Stocker, located in Marin County, California. As founding director of Ocean Conservation Research, which is sound science serving the sea, he is using his fluency in bio-acoustics to explore the impacts of noise on ocean animals to inform ocean policy and practice toward decreasing human bioacoustic impacts on marine habitats. He is an acoustician and naturalist by trade and a musician by avocation. He has written and spoken about marine bioacoustics and the impacts ocean noise pollution on marine life since 1992. Presenting in national and regional hearings, national and international TV, radio and news publications, as well as museums, schools, and universities. His understanding of both physics and biology has proven invaluable in court testimony and legal briefs, defending the environment against the dangers of human-generated noise in the sea. Michael has been a panelist and a presenter at various professional trade and technical conferences presenting on bioacoustics and technology. He has advised and designed environments and technical online systems for a diverse array of clients, including the U.S. National Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., George Lucas's Skywalker Ranch, and various premier Hollywood sound and film studios. And as a member of the American National Standards Institute's Bio-Acoustics Committee, otherwise known as ANSI, and an ANSI delegate to the International Standards Organization, or ISO, Committee on Underwater Acoustics, Michael has been developing more accurate methods of assessing and expressing the dimensions of the marine acoustic environment and the impacts of noise on marine habitats. Michael, great to have you here on Resilient Earth Radio. Thanks for joining us.
Hi there. I'm honored to be here. Thank you for this opportunity.
I just listened to the interview you did on podcast number 21 of Rising Tide with David Helvarg.
Oh, yeah.
Well, that got me thinking about the event that David and others at Blue Frontier did with Dr. Sylvia Earle at the Bolinas event called Celebrate the Sea. And when I walked in, there you were with a bunch of others playing music with some musical instruments. And that got me thinking, what is your background in music and which instruments do you play?
Oh, gosh. Well, I'm a jazz musician, playing piano since I've been 4 years old. And then I started getting into arranging and playing other instruments. So now I guess professionally I play vibraphone, flute, and bass and piano. It started early. I think my family, it's kind of one of the social graces to play a musical instrument. Unfortunately, they started me off with Ms. Breitner, who was from Lithuania, and she was sharing all the joys of Stalinism with me. And she'd be put in jail for some of the stuff she was doing. But it did play into my love of sound. So I was playing music, and I really wanted to be a marine biologist. I think a lot of people who are kind of my age bracket saw Jacques Cousteau's Le Monde de Silence, the silent world, and it was a lot quieter back then, actually, than it is now, for a lot of reasons. But he kind of misled a lot of us. It's the ocean is an acoustical environment. The reason I say it was quieter is because it was really at the apex of commercial whaling. The whale populations were just really decimated. I have a paper out that looks at how loud the ocean was prior to industrialized whaling, and it was actually noisier than it is now. It was natural noise.
Natural.
But then we
Ah.
started doing transoceanic shipping,
Mm-hmm.
and the whale population started increasing, and now a number of them are almost at pre-whaling levels. And these animals are noisy. I mean, they are muttering and singing and thumping and whatever. It's actually an amazing sound when you plop a hydrophone down in the water. You can hear all kinds of good things going on.
I was just thinking your love of music and listening to tonal sounds makes you the perfect person for doing this sort of thing, studying sound and noises in the ocean, then determining what is that human impact. Everything from seismic testing to explosions to the traffic from these ships.
The ocean is 10 times louder now than it was just 50 years ago due to shipping alone.
Mm.
And then, as you mentioned, seismic surveys looking for oil and gas, that is happening pretty much globally, with the exception of the west coast of this continent and the east coast, too. We managed to block that one. But pretty much everywhere else, there's people looking for oil and gas. And when you find it, they start extracting and they need to monitor the deposits, and they are constantly using these seismic surveys to do that. So you can hear seismic surveys, 1,000 miles away.
Hmm.
And they're just what they do is they use these air
Dazzled.
guns that create these big kind of blasts, these booms. And that penetrates down into the substrate. And through that, they're able to read the return and find out what the state of the deposits are.
One of your video clips on YouTube, and anybody can look these up. They're under Michael Stalker of the Ocean Conservation Research Foundation. And in there, you show the miles across the United States, just so that we really understand how far that sound travels.
Yeah, so sound works really well on the ocean. That's why it's an acoustic environment. I mean, water is not compressible. As a consequence of that, you can make a sound in the ocean you can hear 2,000 miles away.
Hmm.
Humans are using that to our own advantage, but the marine animals have been using that too. And it's something I want to maybe get into a little bit later, is that whales, the great whales, will make these really amazing low frequency sounds that you can hear 2,000 miles away. Try to figure out what are they doing with that. Nature is extravagant but not wasteful. So there's a reason why they do that. One of the thoughts about this is that the great whales use those low frequency sounds much like their toothy cousins use the high frequency sounds as a form of sonar, as reading their environment. So they make a low frequency sound and it will bounce off of geological features and come back to them like sonar, except for long distance sonar. That's important in the context of what we're doing with our sound in the ocean as well. Are these animals reading? Well, Chris Clark, who is probably one of the uncles, the granduncles of marine bioacoustics, is up at Cornell University, and he put a paper out. Well, unfortunately, you can't really publish this because you can't do the null exception on this thing, but he was following whales as they migrated from place to place. In this particular case, it was from the Gulf of Alaska down to Hawaii, and it was the humpback whale. They don't just beeline it like using a compass or using stellar navigation. They go over to this seamount over here, and they'll go down to this channel over here. And so they're following geological features, which kind of supports the hypothesis that these animals are using echolocation in long distances to try to figure out where they are.
We'll be right back right after this message.
Coming up on Resilient Earth Radio, Howie Garrett of the Orca Whale Sighting Network, which encourages observation to increase awareness and knowledge about the community of orcas and other marine mammals in the Puget Sound. They foster a stewardship ethic to motivate a diverse audience to take action to protect and restore their critical habitat. They believe it's time to reflect, reconnect, and respond as better caretakers of this planet. Tune in to Resilient Earth Radio, where we are elevating awareness about these critical topics and positive efforts through our radio show and podcast. Thanks for listening. Subscribe below and find us on Facebook and Instagram. We are Resilient Earth Radio, a project of Planet-Centric Media.
You had also mentioned something about how there were whales that reacted in such fear when there was an explosion and they rose to the surface too fast. Talk a little bit about that.
I was doing a lot of acoustical design work, designing museum settings and recording studios, production facilities, and things like that. And in 1992, there was a proposal to sonify the entire ocean so that the U.S. military could talk to our submarines. Kind of a longer, more complicated story than that. Submarines need to be surreptitious, and because of satellite magnetometers, they were able to sense these submarines, and their communication used to be with radio frequencies. They sonify the ocean was the idea behind that, and there were brilliant people working behind this, but the problem is that they would be sonifying the ocean in the context of other animals also using the ocean as a communication channel. So there would going to be some noise interference that I was concerned about. So I started showing up at the public hearings. Yes. So that was in 92. Walter Munk was the guy who really was proposing this. A brilliant physical oceanographer, but like physical oceanographers and not biologists, he looked at animals as if they were input devices, and as long as you didn't exceed any kind of level, you're fine. But these animals live in that environment. If we used our residential noise control statutes around this stuff, we'd live in a completely different place. Anyways, this was going on for a while, and then the Navy was talking about low frequency active sonar as a way of sensing other submarines in the ocean or what have you. Again, another low frequency signal. In the midst of the hearings on that, which was in 2000, there was a military exercise down in the Bahamas, and a bunch, like 17 beaked whales, all washed up after that. And so there was, concern. What we found out it was mid-frequency, not low-frequency sonar, but mid-frequency sonar, but a very nasty Charlie 53 sonar. It sounds like a 300-foot fingernail and a 1,000-foot blackboard. I mean, It just sounds horrible. And these animals were being deafened by this and rising to the surface a little too fast. I mean, beaked whales will go down, 1,000 meters. I mean, the physics of that is pretty amazing. The 32-liter lung capacity gets compressed as they get down into the depths, down to about 2 liters of gas, of oxygen and nitrogen, what have you. And just like humans, if you are down and compressed that way, you have to come up slowly because you have to go through this decompression cycle here. Well, these animals, the Navy poked their ears out with giant ice picks, and they freaked out, and they wanted to breathe first and foremost because that's what they do. They rose too fast, and the gases in their bodies basically expanded. They got a case of the Benz gas emboli, and they looked like milkshakes when they came up. It was really horrible. So that really brought it to the public attention. All of a sudden, we weren't talking about this esoteric low frequency communication systems the Navy was using. We're talking about actual animal habitat that was being compromised.
What did you do back then to help further discussion on that? And did that lead to you creating the Ocean Conservation Research Foundation?
Yeah, I wagged my finger really hard. I was a science advisor for an organization called Seaflow down here. It was a kind of community organization that was talking about this noise pollution issue. But after a number of years of doing that, I realized I needed to roll up my sleeves and get into it. So 2007, founded Ocean Conservation Research and started really looking into it from a scientific standpoint, but also from a policy standpoint, and getting funding to do this. The community-oriented nonprofit was great because people were being informed about it, and it was a fun organization to be with. But in order to really get into this, I had to go to Washington, D.C. I had to talk to Navy people. There's a lot of stuff I had to do, and I needed to kind of do it without the impediments of, or the trappings of a fun community organization, and it'll be more serious than that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And did you have a question for him, Tree?
I was just wondering if you could talk about how the sound interferes with the behavior of whales who rely on acoustics for communication, maybe for finding mates.
Well, as I mentioned at the outset, is that the ocean's acoustic environment, light doesn't really penetrate that far in the ocean. A few hundred feet down, it's pretty dark down there.
Except for
And
the
then,
bioluminescence, which you had mentioned in another video
yeah,
clip.
well,
Yeah.
but even in that, I mean, if you have a real bioluminescent setting, you have a lot of life in the water, you might be able to see that. It looks gorgeous.
Yeah.
It looks like the heavens, with stars in it, but you can only see that stuff for, a few meters. You can't really. And these animals need to, depending upon the species, but they need to communicate over longer distances than that. They need to sense where they are. So there's a number of different really fantastic adaptations. We have basically these pressure sensors in which are basically little eardrums that sense the variations in pressure around us. That can be sensed in the ocean, but there's also what we call particle motion, which is at a molecular level because water is not compressible. Nonetheless, the acoustical energy does transmit through it. So it's like if you scratch your finger on the top of your desktop, you can kind of hear it, but if you put your ear down on the desktop itself, it's very loud.
Yes.
So the coupling is a lot better. And the same thing in the ocean. And animals have adapted in a lot of different ways to this. Some I would advance we don't really even quite understand. For example, if you have a fish is swimming in a very frisky brook, there's a lot of bubbles, there's a lot of noise, a lot of hash, and all of a sudden this little caddisfly lands on top and the fish turns around and grabs it. Well, how can it distinguish that caddisfly acoustically in this stochastic noise? The supposition is that caddisfly is creating a coherent sound field that actually comes at it. And in the midst of all this noise, they hear something that's coherent, and then that's how they sense it. Well, what are the organs that do that? They have these lateral lines. Some of them have swim bladders that couple with their hearing organisms. They have a number of different inputs for this. And it's the same thing with the whales. When the whales have mammal ears, they have an otic capsule that has cochlea in it, and what we have. But
Yes.
there are other organs which we're not quite sure of. I mean, their body is close to the density of water. So when sound impinges on their body, it's likely that they feel it in their body as well. And then I was involved in a necropsy of a gray whale, and there's a really amazing organ that nobody quite knows what it is, but down the rostrum is this kind of envelope of bone that has in it what is acoustical lipids. But that doesn't terminate into a moving thing. It terminates into a porous process in front of the cranium. We don't know what that does. It's quite an elegant organ, and I can only presume that it has something to do with sound because the lipids that it's made of is fatty material is very similar to the lipids that dolphins have in their jaws, which conduct the sound back to their hearing organs. But there's no way you can test this. You can't, take it out of a whale and see if they bump into things. It's
Right.
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 But that's fascinating.
It
I
is.
did not know that. And just shows there's so much more to be learned, and it isn't easy.
Yeah, there was another thing too, kind of maybe it's related to, but I was talking with a neuroscientist the other day on a different show who studies the brains of horses, and he was talking about cortisol levels. And that's something you also mentioned in one of your clips on YouTube about the cortisol levels in their brains.
Yeah, cortisol is basically a proxy for stress.
Yes.
And so we're trying to figure out, what is it? It was really only in the 90s where we started thinking about, well, we're making a lot of noise in the ocean. How's it impacting the critters there? But by that time, the noise was already there. So we don't really have any way to do comparative analysis between sound and no sound. But the situation came up right after the 9/11 thing. Susan Parks has been studying North Atlantic right whales in a lab up in the Bay of Fundy area. And she had also up there Rosalind Rowland, who was studying the cortisol levels in the feces of these North Atlantic right whales just to kind of measure the stress. And so they had these two parallel studies going on. Susan was studying the acoustics, the bioacoustics. And then all of a sudden 9/11 happens and they shut down shipping globally for 6 or 7 days or something like that. And the cortisol levels immediately dropped.
That's
And then
what it
when the
was,
shipping
yes.
started again, they started rising. So it was a pretty clear correlation between shipping noise and the stress levels of the North Atlantic right whale.
Coming soon on Resilient Earth Radio, we talk to Happy Whale, a project which has now identified the majority of living humpback whales in the entire ocean basin, and which provides critical research and knowledge for policies and protections. Now back to our show with Michael Stalker from Marin County, California, founding director of Ocean Conservation Research. He is using his fluency in bioacoustics to explore the impacts of noise on ocean animals and to inform ocean policy and practice toward decreasing human bioacoustic impacts on marine habitats. Thanks for listening to Resilient Earth Radio. Find us on Facebook and Instagram or wherever you get your podcasts.
Scott, did you have something that you wanted to
Yeah,
say?
hi, Michael. You were at our first symposium up in Mendocino High School. You were in the middle of a talk and you were mentioning that right whale work in Bay of Fundy when the fire alarm went off with strobe lights. And
Yeah, I remember that.
yeah, talk about annoying acoustics.
And that was the first Ocean Life
Yeah,
Symposium.
the very first one up there.
Right.
And the only one we gave live.
Right. It's been
Then the plague came
broadcast
along.
on radio and YouTube since.
Yeah. So I was just going to bring that up, but I do have another one. At the Galveston Marine Mammal Biennial, Chris Clark, so I'm glad you mentioned his name already, gave a talk with a number of naval officers about blue whales because they had just declassified information from the submarine listening stations along the East Coast. And Chris made a comment. I'm vocally compromised myself right now, but Chris made a statement to the crowd of us there that a blue whale could form sounds, blast them out toward the East Coast, and the returning information would give the blue whale an image of the East Coast of the United States.
That's kind of what I was implying. Chris has been on this, as I said. This is one of those things you can't really do a null hypothesis on it because the wavelengths are long, the animals are big. You can't take the sense organs out and set them back
Right.
in. You can't block the sound. But the behavior would infer that these animals are using this as a long distance sonar, that they're sensing their surroundings using the sound. The blue whales are interesting, that whole family, the blue sea fin, broody minke whales. They're interesting for a lot of reasons, but one of them is that they pulse. And when they're pulsing, we're talking about they're feeding at distances that are large enough that the pulses essentially are a long way from each other. But from their own particular position, they may be synchronizing. I have a piece I put out, I have to really to confirm it, where there's one minke whale pulsing, it's pretty fast, and all of a sudden a second one comes in, and immediately they entrain. So what's happening there? My speculation is like crickets. How do crickets synchronize? You go outside in a nice warm summer
Right.
night, crickets are all going shicket, shicket, shicket. How do they synchronize? Because their hearing organs are on their elbows. So they're making noise with their wings. The noise that they're making is so much louder right there at their elbows than a cricket that's 2 meters away. They're synchronizing with it nonetheless. So how are they doing that? Well, it turns out when crickets are cricking, they have a neurological blanking that blanks their hearing organs so they can't hear what they're cricking. So how does that help them? If they want to synchronize with something, 2 meters away, they just basically adjust their cricking so that they can't hear anything. And that means all of them, when they're cricking away, they can't hear each other. So why does that help them? Well, if I end up like coming into the scene and the cricket that's nearest to me goes, uh-oh, something's going on here, and slows down a little bit,
Yeah.
all of the other crickets will hear that their little brother is out of the synchronization zone, so they know something's going on there. So they create a community ear.
Boy, you
And
make some thought-provoking comments, Michael. This is Michael Stocker, founder of the Ocean Conservation Research. He studies sounds and noises in the ocean, and especially the sounds that the ocean life makes and the impact on sea life. And this is Resilient Earth Radio on KGUA 88.3 FM. I'm Leanne Lindsay, along with Scott and Tree Mercer of Mendonoma Whale and Seal Study. And Michael, some of the things that you were saying remind me of what Howie Garrett was talking to us about the Orca Network. You know, how they communicate with each other, and maybe how Tokitai may have been communicating with her pod. But it's just so fascinating. You get us to think about crickets and just the way that animals or sea life communicate, or insects. So continue on this, and I want to hear too some of the latest findings that you are coming across and some of the important things our audience might need to know about.
okay, yeah. Well, I mean, so the synchronization thing is interesting. The minke whale pulsing recording that I have, it seems that these animals are in training with each other. So it could be the minke whales are like the giant versions of the crickets synchronizing with each other, so that they somehow manage to convey information through their time relationship with their pulsing. And I have a sound recording of these animals sped up in high speed, and they kind of phase. They sound like cicadas.
Wow.
It seems pretty clear to me. I just need to verify this. The recordings I have, most of the recordings, there's one hydrophone. So we're trying to put together a situation where we have two hydrophones, and then we can do time correlations between two, triangulate, but also listen and find out where these animals are and find out if they are synchronizing relative to each of their bodies. And I think we can prove that.
Now, we didn't ask you this in advance, but do you have that sound available to play? Minke whale synchronization. Pulsing.
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the
Synchronization.
things that also substantiates this is Manolo Castellote has been studying marine mammals for a long time. He's working up in Alaska right now with belugas. He has been for a long time. So he was tracking the migration of fin whales. They were up in, towards Italy, where they were migrating down towards Gibraltar, and he was tracking them. And for the first couple of years, they did a natural migration. But the third year, they went halfway down and then they returned. And so what's going on there? So he had to scan around a little bit. He found that there was seismic surveys happening off of Spain at that time for looking for oil and gas. The fin whales, they pulse. They pulse every maybe 12 to 15 seconds.
The fin whales, don't they?
And if they're synchronizing with each other's pulsing, now we have a pulsing that's going on, also seismic surveys every 12 to 15 seconds off of Spain. But if entrainment is kind of an acknowledgement that you're there, the seismic survey pulses were not in training. They were just incessant. And so the speculation here, again, it's one of the things you can't really prove one way or the other, but, informed speculation was that the fin whales were coming down from the Ligurian Sea. They were pulsing. They heard this other pulse, but there was no entrainment. It's like, oh my God, those guys are psycho. Let's get out of here. And they went back to where they started. So they missed a breeding year.
They missed a breeding year because of that.
Yeah.
That's significant.
So let me see
It
here
is.
if I can share the screen and the sound.
All right. And again, this is KGUA in
Sure.
Wallala, 88.3 FM. We are broadcasting from studios in Wallala on the southern tip of Mendocino, on the coast, north of Sonoma Coast, talking with Michael Stocker today of the Ocean Conservation Research. Go ahead, Michael.
Okay, so this is sped up times 10, but these are minke whales, and they sound a lot like cicadas.
They really do sound like cicadas.
Big surprise there.
And again, that was the minke whales, not the fin whales.
Yeah, that's minkies. They're cousins, they're all shaped like fast missiles.
The minke is the smallest whale, is that right?
Smallest baleen.
Baleen.
Baleen
Yes,
whale.
So this is in training.
Wow.
So let me see if I can get that.
That's like a heartbeat.
Yeah.
So you have a single minky pulsing, dun, 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 dun,
Yeah.
and then the second one comes in, and you hear ka-kung, ka-kung, ka-kung. Well, the paper that I put together on this thing, the reason why they're out of sync, there's like ka-kung, ka-kung, is because they were two different distances from the hydrophone.
Ah.
If they were themselves, we had a hydrophone on one of them, the second one would come in, and then you would see they're synced up. I proved this because I looked at both the distance between the two different pulses and calculated how long sound would have traveled. And then I also looked at the attenuation of the second one versus the first one. And there's a correlation between the distance that sound is traveling and the attenuation that would have happened over that distance in the water. So here it is, a little louder here.
Okay.
There's one, two. So I don't know if you could hear it clearly, but
Oh, we could. Very
yeah,
good.
okay, good.
Explain what they're doing by doing this.
Well,
What does
I
it
mean,
mean?
it could, because the first one that was sped up times 10, you could hear that they were changing their time context with each other. And what are they communicating with that?
Yeah.
We can only suppose.
Right.
There's a lot of things they would be communicating, their relative distance to each other. They could be inferring something about other navigation cues that are important, or where food is, or what have you. There's no way we can ask them, as Wittgenstein says, if we could understand what they were saying, we wouldn't know what they were talking about.
Right. If we could just talk to the whales, talk to the animals.
Yeah.
We'll be right back right after this message.
Need a plumber or a seamstress? Or maybe you want to see what's going on Friday night. Go to the northcoastlink.com, your online business directory and concierge for the Mendonoma Coast. Find out who to know, where to go, and what to do, all on one website. Local event calendars, support groups, community organizations, shopping, dining, lodging, churches, classes, local books, podcasts, radio stations, newspapers, outdoor adventures, and so much more. The northcoastlink.com. Connecting communities that stretch across the northern Sonoma, southern Mendocino coast. The northcoastlink.com. Online business directory and concierge.
So we're talking about a couple of different things. We're talking about the sounds that these sea creatures make, but we're also talking about the impact of human noise too in the ocean. And I wanted to kind of get back to that for a moment, just because there's so much that is continuing happening in our oceans, like deep sea mining discussions and the oil rigs and the wind turbine platforms that are being developed off of Humboldt and coming down to Mendocino County. So can you address some of that, Michael, what you think about that extra noise level that's being introduced to the ocean?
Yeah, this is really important. I mean, animals could, like the fish swimming in the Frisky Brook, they may be able to sort out useful sounds versus noise that's not useful. And they may be able to do it. And what we in our terrestrial environment, there's a thing called masking, or the cocktail party effect, where at some point in time, you don't want to compete with the noise around you because you can't understand what's happening, just too much noise. They may have ways of filtering out coherent versus incoherent or useful versus not useful sounds. We don't know. But the ocean is really noisy. John Hildebrand had done a lot of studies in terms of the kind of the listening range ability of whales. But in terms of the offshore wind stuff, I've been working on offshore wind for the past couple of years now. And the more I got into it, the more I was starting to say, it's it's not as clear cut a benefit of basically unplugging the oil pipeline and plugging in the electrical power cable and heading towards the same cliff. I mean,
Right.
the challenge here is that the noises that are being made, we managed to gum up the works in the 2017 to 2022 5-year offshore oil leasing program in the last administration. The drill baby drill guys wanted to basically completely survey the entire Atlantic coast, but we got on the way there because it's noisy. We're basically having these seismic surveys going on all the time was going to be challenging to the animals that live there. And working with Oceana and Southern Environmental Law Center and Surfrider, North Carolina, we managed to gum up the works, and they weren't able to realize that particular desire of theirs to survey the entire Atlantic. But that was just with air guns. What they're proposing now in the Atlantic and also out here, well, actually in the Atlantic, is pile driving for these turbines. And
right.
that's the same thing. We're going to have thousands of monopiles and various types banging away for years. That's not a healthy thing. And
Exactly.
that's out there. Out here is a slightly different story because it's deeper water. They can't put piles out there in water that's, 1,000 feet deep. But the concern I have, wherever these turbines are and people are not paying attention to, and I have a paper I just submitted it a couple of weeks ago that looks at the infrasonic or low frequency noise that is generated by turbines,
That's what I was
turbine
thinking.
blades.
Yeah.
And helicopters are really noisy. You hear that thwapping of the blade. But, if you're sensitive to your sound environment, you can actually hear before it arrives something's going on. And what is that? That's this low frequency sound, which is not something we actually hear because we only hear from, at below 20 cycles per second, below 20 hertz, we hear it as a rhythm and not as a tone. But below that, we can sense an oscillation of low frequency sounds, and it's stuff that affects our lungs. It oscillates our lungs and kind of cavities, our stomach, our gut. There's energy down there that affects us biologically, and there's a lot of it. And that's a helicopter. Well, if you have a blade that's 300 feet across, it's still creating that thumping noise, which just it's so low. Instead of having it be at 1 hertz or 5 hertz or whatever, it's like one cycle every 10 seconds, 0.1 hertz. And there's a lot of energy there. So now we have 3,000 on the Atlantic, but over here, because there's a Humboldt, there's a Morro Bay, and I guess the Mendocino coast is being planned as well. You have hundreds of these things thwapping away. Now we're in a situation where that low frequency noise penetrates into the ocean and interferes with the whales' low frequency vocalization. We don't know what's going to happen.
Will it disturb their travel?
Yeah, that it will potentially interfere their ability to be able to navigate. Certainly, I was talking to a bunch of bird people because it's not just below the water, it's above the water as well. Birds need to sense pressure variations in barometric pressure variations because that's how they predict weather. When there's an unstable weather front, they'll hang out on the ground and wait till it stabilizes. And then when they have a consistent decrease in barometric pressure, they know they've got a storm front coming, and they'll get up in front of it, and they'll get tailwinds, and then they can move 200-300 miles a day with good tailwinds, and they don't get buffeted by that. But they need to sense the pressure in a clear way. When you have all this thwapping of these, 3,000 on the Atlantic flyway turbines, how is that going to interfere with their ability to be able to sense oncoming weather? And I brought this up to a bunch of ornithologists about a year ago. I was speaking about this, and you could literally hear these guys gasp. There was some interesting work. Douglas Quine was kind of the first guy to put papers out on this. There was a bird race of homing pigeons that, between northern France and southern England, and they've been doing it every year for 150 or some odd years like that. It's kind of a fun thing to do, and they released like 40 or 50,000 homing pigeons, and they have these races and see who arrives first. Well, this one race, it usually takes maybe 6 hours or something like that to do the transit. They didn't arrive.
Oh.
And then, over the next few days, some of them were arriving, but they lost over 40% of the birds.
Oh, dear.
And so they looked into this. What happened?
Yeah.
Well, this was when they were flying the supersonic transport. And the SST was creating the sonic boom of an SST is this double, bam, and there's a lot of energy in it. And so the speculation goes that they deafened these animals, these birds, and could no longer hear where they were.
That makes
And
sense.
they got lost.
Yeah.
And then this guy, John Hagstrom, kind of did a duplicate on this because there were some other races and things that were happening in New York area when they were flying these SSTs. And they're realizing, wow, these airplanes are interfering with these birds' ability to be able to hear it, to the point where they were actually deafening these birds. That they couldn't, they got lost because they were deafened by the boom, boom. Okay, so now we're putting thousands of turbines along the Atlantic flyway. What's that going to do?
Right. What is that going to do?
And the same thing with we have North Atlantic right whales, which are basically navigating up and down that coast there using low frequency sound. Well, there's a kind of a misunderstanding about the air-water boundary in terms of the transmissibility or opacity to sound. At higher frequencies, the sound bounces off that. But as you get into lower frequencies, it's transparent. So that low frequency noise goes into the ocean as well. So all the animals that rely on low frequency sound are going to have another noise to contend with.
And what can people do to educate themselves more on these topics? And how could they possibly take any action to help with these issues? That's one of the things we'd like to talk about.
A zillion, like maybe not a zillion, but 600 or 700 pieces that I've written over the years on ocean-noise.com. They're basically blogs. They're all 500 word or so, pretty easy to find, or easy to read, I should say, pieces on how sound works in our biological environment, but also policy issues and stuff like that. If you can't remember the ocean noise thing, ocr.org, and you can say stay informed, and the newsletter comes up through that as well. And, it's a searchable database and stuff. And if you want to
Nice.
wind, it's just, type in wind in the search and all these wind pieces will come up. When I first started working on this noise in the ocean thing, people said, well, what can we do?
Yeah.
Aside from complain and wag fingers and, vote for the right people, stop buying crap from China. Transoceanic shipping is all us buying stuff.
True. Very
And
true.
so the less stuff that we cycle through, that'll have its
Buy local.
Buy local, that's
buy local, exactly.
Right. We always talk about
Absolutely.
that.
Ride your bicycle.
Yeah.
One of the problems, the United States has got a stunning dearth of public transit. And, when I go to Europe, which is quite often, there's a lot of conferences there and things like that. I belong to the International Standards Organization. And so we meet in Berlin typically. But when I go there, I land, the airplane lands, and I go downstairs and I go to the train station. I buy a ticket. I can go anywhere I want. And if I land in Paris, I can go to Moscow if I want. I can buy a ticket. I was in Washington, D.C. in April, and I wanted to get up to Pittsburgh, and I thought, well, let's see, how Amtrak works. It's a 5.5 hour car drive, but I decided I was going to take a train. It's a long saga of how I finally was able to get a ticket, but 36 hours later, I landed in Pittsburgh.
Oh, my goodness.
Oh, no. What
Yeah.
happened?
It's hopeless. So until we get public transit, but everybody here, wants to drive their own car. That's the freedom that we have. We can drive around in all electric F-150 Ford trucks. That's not solving our problem.
No.
I have taken Amtrak to Colorado a few times to see my sister there, but
Did it work out?
yes, I enjoyed it.
Yeah.
And it was easier. I got my own place to sleep, and they have, a restaurant on board, and they have beautiful, like, glass top on the cars so you can see the scenery as you're going
Nice.
through all these
Yeah.
these different locations and states. It's very interesting.
It could be, yeah, it could be really beautiful. It was a slow train. I mean, even if it was on time and it didn't break down, and and I made my connections and stuff like that, it was still 11 hours.
Wow.
And it only takes 5.5 hours to drive it. So and whereas, like, I was in Lyon a little while back, I wanted to get to Madrid, so I took the high-speed rail there. It's like a 6-hour trip, and I think we left at like 11 at night or something like that. And these guys are going like, 250
I
kilometers
know.
an hour.
I've done the
They're
ISA
moving right
train
along.
the ISA train in Germany is like a
Yeah,
bullet train. It's
bullet trains.
fast.
And so it's pulling in early in the morning. I've been sleeping, and all of a sudden the train's slowing down, and I go, "Oh my God, I'm gonna miss." I gather all my stuff together, and I step out on the train platform. Turns out I'm at the outskirts of Madrid,
Oh,
like way out there. I go, oh no! I mean, if this is California, I'm gonna have to wait at least 36 hours for the next train to come through. I'm sitting here kind of, oh, what am I gonna do? And then the next train comes through 5 minutes later. I
oh,
jump on it.
wow.
We're good.
So, Tree and Scott Mercer of Mendonoma Whale and Seal Study, do you have any last things that you'd like to ask Michael Stocker here with the Ocean Conservation Research about the studies he does of sound in the oceans?
No, just a couple of stories you reminded me of. In 1981, I was working in Trinity Bay with Peter Beamish. I'm sure you've come across Peter's name, very complex man.
Yeah.
And he was recording minke whales in Trinity Bay back at that time, and he wasn't sure what to do with the recordings. At that time, he was hoping to be able to communicate in some way with that pulsing. You reminded me of that with your recordings. And in early 90s, I was a couple hundred miles offshore observing sperm whales off the east coast of the United States. We were over Hydrographers and Oceanographers Canyon. And SST took off from JFK Airport. And I know the noise you made because we thought something had exploded in the down below in the boat. There was that boom, boom. The whole boat shook. And
Really?
the crew ran down into the engine room. We thought something had blown up. So
Wow,
just
that
imagine,
loud.
how that sounded below us, how that would have sounded.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah.
I know about this because my dad worked on the SR-71. He designed the guidance system for the SR-71,
Wow.
and they were flying them over Los Angeles at that time, and they were pretty high. They were like 17 miles up, and you would hear this boom, boom, and so you'd know that was going on. But when they're taking off or slow, there's a lot of energy in that, and I'm glad they're not flying those things right now.
Massive percussive sound.
Yes. Yeah.
And Michael, in the last few minutes, go ahead and address some of the topics that are top of mind for you right now that you want to bring attention to.
Well, I'm trying to get this idea of using less energy into the conversation, but I was on these calls with NRDC and Audubon and NWF and whatever, and we were evaluating the wind farms and the noise and, trying to figure out how to do this safely.
Yeah.
And as I started getting into it, I think, we really need to start talking about using less energy. These guys did not want to do that. They wanted to talk about using energy responsibly or generating it responsibly, but they all belong to this organization called Renewable Energy Wildlife Institute, REWI.org. And they're all of the big NGOs are there, Sierra Club and Ducks Unlimited and blah, blah, blah. But also BP, ExxonMobil, Shell. So these guys are in the hot tub with the energy guys, and they don't care how the energy is generated. They just want to sell it.
Right.
And that is our problem. We've somehow correlated, this doesn't sound like an acoustical comment, but somehow we've correlated energy use with economic growth. And somehow we prioritized our cultural success metric as the more money, the better. We have to start unhinging these things. We have to make a distinction between wealth and value, and we have to unhook this idea that continuous economic growth is a good thing for culture and society, and the correlation of that we have to use more energy to have more economic growth. Those are, they're systematic things that they will work if we get down to it, but unfortunately we're stuck in. So that's, as I say, it's not particularly acoustic, but it's the byproduct of this society that we're living in, which is based on consumption growth. The only thing that grows continuously in nature, I like to say, is cancer.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's philosophical. It's not acoustic.
Resilient Earth Radio, recorded right here at the KGUA studios in Wallala on the southern Mendocino coast, and the Sonoma North Coast is where we broadcast, but we also stream everywhere in the world that you get internet, and just go to kgua.org and click Listen Live, and a streaming app will pop up that you can save to any device. Okay. I've had Tree and Scott Mercer of the Mendonoma Whale and Seal Study here with me today, are my co-producers and co-hosts. I'm Leanne Lindsay. We've been talking with Michael Stalker of the Ocean Conservation Research Foundation, and Michael, he's a musician, jazz. He understands tones and sounds, and this is what he's dedicated his life to. Michael, you just mentioned earlier that people can go to ocean.noise.com. They can also sign up for your newsletter at ocr.org. Thank you so much for contributing to our radio show and podcast today. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, Leanne. Thanks, Tree and Scott. I really appreciate you guys. And if you have one of your events up there, again, just call me. I'd love to hang
Wonderful.
We
Coming
will.
up soon.
Yeah.
Yep.
Thank
October.
you, Michael.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Okay.
All right. Take
Thank you,
care.
Michael.
Bye-bye. That will do it for Resilient Earth Radio. Thanks for listening to KGUA in Wallala, 88.3 FM. Thanks for listening to Resilient Earth Radio, where we talk about critical issues facing our planet and the positive actions people are taking. I'm Leanne Lindsay, producer and host, along with my co-producers and co-hosts, Scott and Tree Mercer of the Mendonoma Whale and Seal Study. Produced in association with Planet Centric Media, Sea Storm Studios, and KGUA 88.3 FM, a public radio station on the Northern California coast. You can find us on Facebook and Instagram and wherever you get your podcasts. Music is Castle by the Sea from the ballet The Sea Princess, created by Eric Alleman, an international composer and pianist who lives in the Sea Ranch on the North Sonoma coast.